Our topic tonight is Joseph Smith and polygamy. We're going to be talking about the case for Joseph Smith and the origins of polygamy in the Latter-day Saint movement. So I want to start by talking about the historical consensus on this topic. So W. Grant McMurray served as prophet and president of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, my own church here, my denomination, when the church changed its name to Community of Christ in 2001. Grant McMurray was also the first RLDS president who has actually academically trained in theology. Subsequently, his successor, Steve Veazey, also has a theology degree. And he was the first to be ordained from outside the Smith family. So in other words, everybody before, beginning back to Joseph Smith himself, was one of Joseph Smith's sons or grandsons or great-grandson. So to date, McMurray is also the only RLDS president with any historical training. So he began his career in church employment as the assistant church historian. He was assistant to Richard Howard, who was in fact the very first person who held the title. It was an official title of church historian, but all of his predecessors were not actually academically trained historians. They were vernacular historians or antiquarians. And so Richard Howard, who began his tenure in the 1960s, was the first historian of the church who was actually academically trained in history. And that corresponded to the time when, for the very first time in the movement really, as people were returning to North America after World War II and going to the GI Bill, and college expanded, graduate school expanded, this was really the first time that large numbers of Americans and Canadians were, in graduate schools in general, and so therefore that anybody in the Latter-day Saint movement, in a broad sense, were academically trained in this way. So 2 years after he stepped down as church president, Grant McMurray attended a conference of the John Whitmer Historical Association in 2006. This was actually a conference. I was the executive director along with my partner Mike Karpowitz at the time of JWHA, and we helped to coordinate this conference. And at the conference, Grant asserted, quote, "I want to identify some things that we need to say so as to free ourselves from mistaken ideas that can deter us from effectively moving into the future." And he's speaking here to the Community of Christ, the RLDS community. And he listed off two things before this that he needed to come to terms with. And then this is the third thing that he felt we needed to come to terms with, which is to say, he said, Joseph Smith and polygamy did. So Joseph Smith did practice polygamy. He says, "I thought this battle had finally been won a decade or two ago." So this was 2 decades ago that he said this, because indeed, historical consensus was certainly reached by the 60s and 70s. But anyway, but it reared its ugly head again recently. Our handling of it was not distinguished. I don't think we will ever fully know the extent of Joseph Smith's involvement in the introduction and practice of polygamy. However, McMurray says, no credible historian is arguing today that he had no involvement whatsoever. So in other words, there's a total historical consensus among all credible historians that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. So the goals of our presentation tonight are to separate our understanding of history from our theology, from our beliefs as a church. I also then want to lay out some of the evidence that has led to this complete consensus among historians that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. I want to examine what Emma Hale Smith knew, and also then what her son Joseph Smith III knew. And then finally, I want to explore how Joseph Smith III's sons presented an inaccurate position in good faith when they in turn, this is Frederick Madison Smith, Israel A. Smith, and then W. Wallace Smith, when they in turn served as presidents and prophets of the Reorganized Church. Specifically, Fred M. and Israel A. Smith routinely preached their belief that their grandfather had not practiced polygamy. But of course, they were not historians, and they didn't have the evidence. They were speaking in good faith. They were not lying. They were not anything like that. And their testimonies have become kind of entrenched in members of the church who grew up in that kind of era, or soon thereafter in the W. Wallace Smith era. Okay, so I want to start here then talking about the difference between identity narratives, what we sometimes call sacred story, what's sometimes also called myths, but we also have kind of a negative connotation for the word myth, especially when we have when we contrast it with history and we put way too much value in historicity, or we have for the last couple centuries. So in some ways, identity narratives and sacred stories are way more important to people than actual history. And then people have only had access to actual history for a much, much shorter time. Certainly in our movement, like I say, it's only been for half a century or so. So humans form identity through narrative, sharing stories that explain who we are as individuals and as groups. So, for example, in the United States, when presidents give their State of the Union addresses, they know that listeners are rarely swayed by arguments that focus on statistics. So those would be rational and relevant arguments. You could say, if we spent this small amount of this, we would save this in the long run. If we did this sort of thing, there are this percentage of people wouldn't be killed, and so on. People are not moved by that. So instead, presidents pack the visitor galleries of Congress with individuals whose narratives convey the proposed policy emotionally. So they hope, in that sense, to sway voters with those people's stories so that people are in favor of a policy, as opposed to, doing something that's rational or makes sense statistically. Likewise, when we're meeting somebody for the first time, we don't describe ourselves with statistics and saying something like, I'm 1.93 meters tall. I'm about 100 kilograms, 48 years old. I just turned 52, etc. Instead, we tell stories about ourselves and our past that we think explain who we are. And then even when you're a couple, you often share stories together that tells who you are, as a couple. And couples will often compete to tell the stories, and they'll maybe either jump over each other as each one of them is kind of telling the same story, or they have a regular shtick while they're telling them, and so on. We know that that's how people form their identities, both individually as couples and so forth. So when we're considering the difference between identity narratives and history, the George Washington cherry tree story, that's one of the most famous, it has the ironic purpose of demonstrating Washington's honesty and integrity. So in other words, even though we haven't been able to identify historical basis for the story is about the idea that George Washington cannot tell a lie, that he had a very special integrity right from childhood. And nevertheless, that true purpose of that identity story, that may be true, even if there is no historicity to the story. So the story might be entirely a myth, but it nevertheless may still be true that George Washington was a person of exceptional honesty, right? So we have an example of that, one of the very famous identity stories in the Restoration movement. So my ancestors helped sacrifice to build the Kirtland Temple in Ohio in the 1830s, one of the most sacred spaces in the Restoration and in Community of Christ. We have a cherished story that the women of the church at that time gave up all their fine china, which was then crashed and ground up in order to be mixed into the exterior finishing so that the exterior stucco of the temple would sparkle. So the only problem with that story, which is much beloved, is we don't have any contemporary narratives of it. In other words, people start telling that story generations later, and so we can't date it to the time period. And also realistically, it doesn't make a lot of sense. There is all kinds of, for example, waste glass and so forth that you would have access to, broken glass that you could be using to make things sparkle. And if you actually had fine china, you could sell that in order to, make the kind of money, to get a whole bunch more waste glass and so forth. Anyway, that said, the meaning of the story is actually true. So the meaning of the story is that church members, my great-great-great-great-grandparents and so on, they sacrificed everything in order to build this building that was beyond their capacity. The very first building that they tried to build, they hadn't even built little churches before, and now they built this vast grand temple. And they frankly bankrupt the church. They lose everything, including possession of the temple for a while, and a lot of people have to flee the state and so on because they weren't able to pay their debts about it. So in other words, they did sacrifice all to build that, whether or not this particular identity story is historical or whether it's a sacred story, a myth, it nevertheless is conveying something true. So, traditionally, members of the Restoration of the Latter-day Saint movement have not clearly separated their religious beliefs, their theology, from their identity narratives, which they've long presumed are history. And I'll mention that I think that this remains quite true with the much larger Utah-based Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, which, for example, for some of these identity stories, like in this case, there's a picture here of one of their statues of the angels, Peter, James, and John, restoring the Melchizedek priesthood by appearing as a visitation and putting their hands on Joseph Smith's head and so forth. Historians have looked at this, and everyone agrees that this story is ahistorical. So in other words, it's a story that is introduced later than when it was supposed to have happened, and it reflects an understanding of priesthood that didn't exist at the time when it's supposed to have happened. And so it's anachronistic, and yet the LDS Church will continuously so insist that it's this visitation actually is a historical event that they make life-size bronze statues of it all over the place and so forth. Anyway, so what I'm just trying to say is here that because there has been a tradition of misunderstanding, separating beliefs from history, that has continued to be a problem in the movement, but it has always been a problem in the movement. Indeed, the LDS leaders continue to base their authority claims on these narratives, which I've said, like I say here, are not historical. Okay, to help Community of Christ members navigate the difference between their religious belief, their theology, and history, the current prophet president of the church, Stephen M. Vesey, has outlined a set of 9 church history principles, and these have become part of the church's identity, mission, message, and beliefs. And we have a document called Sharing in Community of Christ, and we uphold these as our current identity, mission, message, and belief ideas. So I want to just explore here, just as a preface, a couple of these affirmations, a couple of these church history principles. So the very first one begins, continuing exploration of our history is part of our identity formation. As a church, we seek always to clarify our identity, message, and mission. In our faith story, we see clearly God's Spirit giving this faith community tools, insights, experiences for divine purposes. A people with a shared memory of their past and an informed understanding of its meaning are better prepared to chart their way into the future. So that last statement I think is really important. We share sacred stories to form our identity. But if we are informed of their conclusion, if we are informed by the conclusions of academic history, we are better able to understand the meaning of those past events. So affirmation 2. History informs, but does not dictate our faith and beliefs. The foundation and continuing source for our faith is God's revelation in Jesus Christ. So let's separate out faith and history. Studying history is not about proving or disproving mystical, spiritual, or revelatory experiences that birth or transform religious movements. In fact, indeed, academic history doesn't do anything of the kind. It can't be used for that purpose, can't be properly used for that purpose. Rather, sound history informs our faith, and healthy faith leads to insights about history. This continues. Theology and faith, guided by the Holy Spirit, must play an important role in discovering the enduring meaning of such events, as well as the deeper truths found in them. Our understanding of our history affects our faith and beliefs. However, our past does not limit our faith and beliefs to what they were historically. Okay, I'm going to skip a couple and go to affirmation 5. Seeking both the faithfulness and human flaws in our history makes it more believable and realistic, not less. Our history has stories of great faith and courage that inspire us. Our history also includes human leaders who said and did things that can be shocking to us from our current perspective and culture. We can think, for example, of all of the things the Apostle Paul has to say about slavery and women and all kinds of other things that are bound up, gay people and so forth, that are bound up in the worldview that he is part of, and his statements are therefore limited by his own limitations of time and place, right? So historians try not to judge. Instead, they try to understand by learning as much as possible about the context. So in other words, the idea that Paul is simply talking about what everybody understands in the Hellenistic worldview. He's not giving special revelation about sexual orientation or something like that. So the context and the meaning of those words and the actions at the time. The result then should be empathy instead of judgment, where we then start, condemning the figure in their time and place. Our scriptures are consistent in pointing out that God, through grace, uses imperfect people for needed ministry and leadership. And so when I talked about this a couple Sundays ago, I talked about how obviously the stories attributed to King David about his affair with Bathsheba and then his connivance at getting her husband, his loyal soldier Uriah the Hittite, killed, are egregious abuse of power as described. But that does not mean that, David is somehow the villain of the Bible or any such thing. In fact, David is the emblematic king, the emblematic Old Testament anointed one, Messiah, who is, as far as Christians understand, a precursor or prototype for the later, Messiah of the New Testament, Christ. So leaders in the past were flawed and they made errors the same way we are and do today. We and people in the past share humanity together. Okay, affirmation 6. The responsible study of church history involves learning, repentance, and transformation. A church with a mission focused on promoting communities of reconciliation, justice, and peace should be self-critical and honest about its history. It's important for us to confess when we have been less than what the gospel of Jesus Christ calls us to be. This honesty prompts us to repent, and it strengthens our integrity. It's a really important, very important history principle. Admitting past mistakes, it goes on to say, helps us avoid repeating them and frees us from the influences of past injustices and violence in our history. We must be humble and willing to repent individually and as a community to contribute as fully as possible to restoring God's shalom on earth. So, one of my experiences growing up in the Utah-based Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which I left when I became an adult, At age of 8, that was the very first moment that the LDS Church formally abandoned its entrenched racist policies of denying both temple ordinances, in other words, just central to the full participation in the church to African Americans, actually anyone with African origin and descent, and also priesthood ordination. And so that had been a fixed policy from Brigham Young on and all the way up until 1978, when the policy was simply changed. But that policy, when it was changed, did not come with an apology. It did not come with any kind of confession of wrongdoing, of error, of how all of the preceding prophets from Brigham Young on, who said horrific racist things from the pulpit. If you go back and just Google Brigham Young statements on this, it wasn't. There was no statement that said Brigham Young was wrong about this. It was simply silence. And so as a result of just moving on without learning and repenting, learning about the errors, admitting errors without repentance, of course, the church immediately falls into exactly the same error in terms of discrimination against women, shutting down women's ordination, not allowing full participation of women in the church, and of course, the long-standing anti-LGBTQIA activism of the LDS Church. So in other words, in order to, just like individuals, institutions repeat errors and sin if they do not repent and learn from their errors. Okay. Church History Principles, Affirmation 7. The church has a long-standing tradition that it does not legislate or mandate positions on matters of church history. Historians should be free to draw their own conclusions after thorough consideration of evidence. Okay, so that's enough of that. So I appreciate if anyone who is joining me, and which a lot of you are, who do not have a Community of Christ or Restoration tradition background, I appreciate you allowing me to have a lot of preface here. This is a critically important identity formation topic for those of us inside the movement. And so I'm trying to approach this very thoughtfully. So that said, a church is not a history association. Our church history principles explain that Community of Christ neither makes definitive historical assertions, nor do we base our authority on historical claims at all. As a church, we are non-creedal. We uphold the enduring principle of unity in diversity. In other words, we are one together, but we are diverse in our views and beliefs and so forth. And we also have and articulate and uphold principles of faithful disagreement. So if you're part of my faith community with me, if you're a part of Community of Christ, you are not required to agree even when there is a historical consensus. Okay, so for example, in our recent 3-volume History of the Church, an incredible resource that the most recent church historian, Mark Shearer, researched and wrote at long length, and I was very happy to be part of this process where I designed the covers, I did all the book design, typesetting, and I did all of the maps and so on. I was very happy to be part of this team. It's an incredible resource, but it's not an official history. The church does not mandate positions on matters of church history. So to just drive the point home, so what are the ramifications of our church history principles? If we asked, what is the church's position on Joseph Smith's role in the origin of Mormon polygamy? The answer is the church has a long-standing tradition that it does not legislate or mandate positions on church history. And that's all equally vital when we're talking about, for example, all the other things that we look into on this channel. So what is the church's position on whether the historical Jesus actually said and did all the things ascribed to him in Scripture? Same answer. The church has a long-standing tradition that it does not legislate or mandate positions on church history. It's not a history club. That's not the point of what we're doing. Okay. Nevertheless, when one is a church historian, when you're a historian like I am, but also a pastor, we shouldn't be simply debunking, when we also shouldn't be doing hagiography. So when we have awareness that sacred stories are very different from academic history and have a different purpose, so in other words, the identity formation versus academic history's purpose, which is determining the most likely scenario of events of the past, that should help church historians be aware that our job is not simply debunking. There's a pastoral component to this position. On the other end, though, the job should also not to be hagiography. Hagiography is like writing a saint's life, and that involves sanitizing and thereby distorting the life of real people in history, telling only the good, ignoring all the flaws and errors. I think this is a crazy practice, goes back all the time. Hagiography is something that was the beginning of biography, frankly, in the West, as medieval clerics would write saints' lives, and the saints were all perfect. And then we might wonder, well, why are none of us perfect? In other words, this is setting people up to have superhuman lives and qualities which are totally alien to the actual human experience. So hagiography, no. Nor, though, should historians have conclusion-driven apologetics, where one starts with the conclusion first and then cherry picks the evidence to insist that because something is impossible to disprove, it might have happened. And that is a time-honored tradition in church apologetics. It's certainly at the center of the Mormon apologetic tradition. Okay, so for tonight, as we are looking now at the kind of evidence where we have for Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy, I want to look at broadly two different types of evidence. And the central one here is primary accounts that were written or published in Joseph's life. So accounts by insiders and witnesses and so on that were written down in Joseph Smith's life. And then primary accounts that were written or published after his death, but are still, in other words, eyewitness people who were in the know and were in the inner circle and so on. So if we divide those two circles into four quadrants, before, in the old days, in the RLDS Church, before the RLDS Church had members who were trained in the academic discipline of history, they routinely ignored any evidence other than what was inside this particular sliver, so one quarter here. So these are the insiders who were loyal to Joseph Smith during Joseph Smith's life, and who after 1860 followed Joseph Smith III. So in other words, if you are part of the RLDS Church, then we'll listen to you. Any other evidence will just dismiss you as being, you're not part of our tradition, you're part of a broad-based conspiracy against us, we're the true church, you're all false, and so on. So that's the only evidence that, broadly speaking, was considered before before we actually had academic history. Next, we have insiders who were loyal to Joseph Smith throughout in his life, but who afterwards followed Brigham Young after 1844. And so these folks continue to be believers in Joseph Smith, but they now are Brighamites. In other words, they're following Brigham Young out to Utah. And so, as I say, this was dismissed by the followers of Joseph Smith III and those saints who stayed in the Midwest. But nevertheless, since Brigham Young led the largest faction of the church, this quadrant here obviously includes the largest number of witnesses, and actually also, since, as we'll later see, Emma and Joseph III represented the pre-existing anti-polygamy faction of the church, and Brigham Young represented the polygamy faction, more of the polygamists obviously sided with Brigham Young and are part of that, so they're going to be in there. Nevertheless, as with every source, we still have to read these in light of their biases, and so in the same way that RLDS sources have a pro-RLDS bias, likewise too, pro-Brigham Young sources have a pro-Brigham Young bias that we have to be aware of as we're looking at them. Next, however, we have all of the testimonies of people who were loyal to Joseph Smith in their life, but who opposed both Brigham Young and Joseph III after Joseph Smith's death. So in other words, people who continued to be believers in Joseph Smith and the Restoration, but are parts of other traditions. In other words, they're not Brighamites, they're not Josephites, they're in one of the other camps, be it the Cutlerites, the Whiteites, the Strangites, and so forth. So the old RLDS narrative that tried to paint everything, everybody who was involved in polygamy as part of a pro-Brigham Young conspiracy never adequately explains this quadrant. It doesn't make any sense why people who hate Brigham Young and oppose his leadership nevertheless all agree that they had been taught polygamy by Joseph Smith and so on, and continue to practice it after Joseph Smith's death. Like I say, the old RLDS narrative can't explain it at all. We also then have the other quadrant, which was ignored in the olden days when we just considered people to be apostates and write them off. Nevertheless, we do have important contemporary and later testimony from insiders, key insiders, who broke with Joseph Smith and left the movement during Joseph Smith's lifetime. And so key people like Oliver Cowdery, such an important early leader, and I would also argue William Law, those have to be read. Obviously, it has to be read with their later anti-Joseph Smith bias understood, but they can't just simply be ignored. So I want to look at all of those kinds of quadrants of history, or of evidence. Okay, we'll also consider, though, what are the evidence against Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy. So the most relevant of any of this here is during Joseph Smith's lifetime, Joseph Smith and the church issued a series of official denials. And that was church policy. It continued to be Brigham Young's church's policy all the way up into the 1850s, even though it was very clear that he and everybody in his church were practicing polygamy, they still routinely denied it because that had been the policy. And even up until when they finally, they were settled enough in Utah that they decided that they'll go ahead and come clean. The message gets to Europe, where Brighamite missionaries have just barely published huge apologetics and defenses where they're claiming, again, denials that they aren't practicing polygamy. Suddenly this manifesto issues out, gets to them, crosses the Atlantic from all the way from Utah, and they're immediately caught in their lie and flat-footed, and they're like, oh, well, forget what we were just saying. Now we're going to be honest. So we're no longer going to have this policy of official denial. There's no reason to imagine that just because Brigham Young's faction of the church changed this policy of official denial, that would have any effect, for example, on someone like Emma Smith, for whom the policy had always been the way it had been, and what Brigham Young says or doesn't say or changes or doesn't is not relevant. So, although, as I say, Emma seems to have generally continued the policy of public denial, we actually do not have her own account. So a lot of folks in Community of Christ think that we have what we sometimes have referred to as Emma's last testimony, where she makes the case, where she states that she was Joseph Smith's only wife. We'll see how, even if she had said that, which we can't be sure that she did, we don't have any letter of hers or anything like that. What we have in terms of that document is notes that her son, who had his own very particular position, took, and how he couched that later. So we don't have Emma's own words. You maybe think, well, Joseph would have been exactly a straight shooter on this at all times. We'll see he has his own very serious framework through which he is understanding polygamy that could have affected that. So we don't actually have Emma's words. We have only what other people said she said. And another account of what people said she said, William McClellan, who had been an apostle in the early church and who later was the leader of one of the factional churches, he says he talked to Emma, who very directly admitted to polygamy and how it had been practiced and how it was an error and so forth. And so, again, that's hearsay testimony, what Emma said. We would love to have what Emma herself said or written if such a thing existed, but unfortunately we don't. We do have lots of other evidence, and we'll talk about that, about what Emma knew and didn't know. We also have, for example, William Smith, who was an insider, who later, when he's part of the Reorganization, the last surviving Smith brothers, so of all of Joseph Smith's brothers, they're all dead except for William. He made many, many public denials of polygamy when he's part of the Reorganization. Nevertheless, we'll find out that because William Smith had been a notorious polygamist himself, those denials are not actually credible. The other quadrants also lack evidence against Joseph Smith's practice. So, for example, even the Cutlerites, who later denied polygamy, they had originally practiced it. So Alphaeus Cutler, who led his own faction of the church, for a time he had engaged had additional six marriages. He continued to live in the Midwest and decided that the practice was not viable. We don't really know what he did, but he essentially dissolved all of those, and they essentially, everybody in his faction stopped practicing polygamy. They dissolved the families and then never talked about it ever again. But we do have evidence that they had been practicing it, so, for example. And indeed, what we just have to say in terms of evidence against Smith's practice of polygamy, the principal mover of the claim that Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of the movement, did not practice polygamy was his son, Joseph Smith III, a boy who was only 11 at the time of his father's death and was therefore pretty understandably not in the loop. So in other words, these are adult things. It was a secret. He wasn't part of the secret, and so on. If he knew anything about it, he knew how much his father had been fighting with his mother and how upset his mother had been and continued to be in this whole thing. Okay, so now that those are the kinds of evidence, I want to start to lay things out. First off, I want to show the little gleanings of evidence that we have for where did these early contemplations of polygamy even come from. So the Old Testament accounts, polygamy is practiced by the patriarchs of ancient Israel. And for example, it's a major theme in the stories of Abraham and Jacob. So Abraham has promised that he's going to have descendants as numerous as the sand, but his wife is barren. So at a certain point, he takes Hagar and eventually other concubines in order to produce offspring. God does not actually command that ever. And indeed, in the story, God eventually gives a son to his wife, right? Likewise, in the story of Jacob or Israel, he has essentially, there's two daughters, Rachel and Leah. He wants to marry Leah. His father-in-law, he wants to marry Rachel, I'm sorry. His father-in-law switches them. He has to work longer and so on. And so between Rachel and Leah and their two maids who become concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah, Jacob has 12 kids, the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, so in other words, these are major plot points. But in neither case, actually, is polygamy commanded by God, but it's also not explicitly condemned by God. So Joseph Smith was apparently dwelling on these stories as early as 1829 as he was dictating the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon includes a much stronger condemnation of polygamy than is found in the Bible. So we read in the Book of Mormon in the book of Jacob, chapter 2, "Wherefore I, the Lord God, will not suffer that this people," the people of the Nephites in the New World in the Book of Mormon, "that this people shall do like unto them of old. Wherefore, my brethren, hear me, and hearken unto the word of the Lord. For there shall not be any man among you have, save it be one wife, and concubines he shall have none. For I, the Lord, delight in the chastity of women, and whoredoms are abomination before me. Thus saith the Lord of hosts." So anyway, this is a pretty much more stark condemnation, actually. What we can just say about it is it's showing that Joseph Smith is thinking about Old Testament polygamy at the time of the Book of Mormon. So there is also some indication that soon thereafter, when the church is organized, Joseph Smith may have been contemplating polygamy with Native American wives. So the church's publisher, W.W. Phelps, later asserted that Joseph Smith was contemplating a limited practice of polygamy as early as 1831. Phelps, who later did follow Brigham Young's faction of the church, in other words, he became a Brighamite, so we can remember that as we're thinking of our biases. Phelps wrote in an 1861 letter to Brigham Young that Joseph Smith had told him, "It is Christ's will that in time," he's speaking to leaders of the church in 1831, men, male leaders, "ye should take unto you wives of the Lamanites and Nephites," so those are the name in the Book of Mormon for Native Americans, "that their posterity may become white, delightsome, and just, for even now their females are more virtuous than the Gentiles." So this is a lot of Native American stereotyping and everything, and also, again, this doctrine that unfortunately is in the Book of Mormon, or anyway, idea in the Book of Mormon of that is connecting whiteness with delightfulness and so on. But the idea of it here is anyway that the leaders, the Gentile leaders, the settler leaders of the church will take Native American wives. So Phelps asked, given that he and the other leaders were already married, Joseph Smith, how could it be possible that we could ever take native wives? To which he says, Smith replied, quote, "In the same manner that Abraham took Hagar and Keturah, and Jacob took Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah." So in other words, although I'd argue Rachel's not a concubine, but in any event, Hagar, Keturah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, in other words, as concubines, since as following again these Old Testament stories. So whether or not that's true, and there's some problems with W.W. Phelps, he's an important early leader, and he's famous, for example, still in the church. He's the composer of our anthem, "The Spirit of God Like a Fire is Burning." Nevertheless, one bit of contemporary evidence that backs that up, so not a later affidavit or later letter like Phelps is writing. Ezra Booth, who had been an insider who left the church and then started publishing exposés as letters to the Ohio Star, in 1831, he claimed that Joseph Smith was contemplating creating an alliance with Native American tribes at the Indian frontier. So at the other side of the church was having a colony in Independence, Missouri, which is at the edge of the Indian frontier. So the Indians were on the other side of the border in what's now Kansas, the Indian Territory then, contemplating native marriage alliances. So there's some contemporary source that sort of backs that up. Okay, but anyway, that may not be anything. We're just talking about possibilities that Joseph Smith is thinking about this as early as the origin of the church. However, the next major incident is Joseph Smith's alleged affair with Fanny Alger. So if Smith was musing about marriages with the natives, nothing came of that idea. So when church members took the Book of Mormon to the natives actually showed no interest in that. They did not see themselves in the book, and they really weren't interested in the church and so on. So those alliances, the opportunity for that never appeared. However, in the mid-1830s, the church, when it was established in Kirtland, Ohio, its headquarters was rocked by a scandal when key leaders began to allege that Joseph Smith had been caught having an affair with a girl named Fanny Alger. So church member Ann Eliza Webb, who lived in Kirtland and was about 18 at the time, she talked about the alleged affair, which she later recalled, quote, "Mrs. Smith, Emma Smith, had an adopted daughter, a very pretty, pleasing young girl, about 17 years old. She was extremely fond of her. No one mother could be more devoted. And their affection for each other was a constant object of remark, so absorbing and genuine did it seem. Consequently, it was with a shocked surprise that the people heard that Sister Emma had turned Fanny out of the house. The sudden movement was incomprehensible, Since Emma was known to be a just woman, not given to freaks or caprices, and it was felt that she certainly must have had some very good reason for her action. By degrees, it became whispered about that Joseph's love for his adopted daughter was by no means a paternal affection, and his wife, discovering the fact, at once took measures to place the girl beyond his reach. All right, so there's many other recollections of this scandal. Anne Eliza Webb, is later, again, became a Brighamite and so on, but lots of the people who remembered this, including a relative of mine, Benjamin Winchester. Benjamin Winchester later became a Rigdonite apostle in Sidney Rigdon's church, a rival faction to the LDS Church and also to Community of Christ. He was also an ardent opponent of both Brigham Young and polygamy. He nevertheless remembered that there was a bunch of scandal about this at the time and so forth. Okay. Contemporary members of the church in Kirtland were strongly opposed to the idea that affairs could be legitimized, for example, as polygamous marriages using the Old Testament as a precedent. And so I mention that because all the way through this time period, going all the way back to the beginning, there are factions within the church. And one faction is quite consistently opposed to any idea of adding Old Testament polygamy, of restoring the Old Testament practice of polygamy as part of the restoration. And certainly this was the majority faction in the middle of the 1830s in Kirtland. And so when Joseph Smith was actually out of town, he's off preaching in Michigan, Oliver Cowdery, who had been, one of the early leaders of the church, the second elder, the principal scribe of the Book of Mormon, one of the three witnesses of the Book of Mormon. Oliver Cowdery wrote a document on marriage. He and other leaders in Kirtland convened a general assembly of the church, which took the document on marriage and voted that it be added to the new Book of Doctrine and Covenants, which W.W. Phelps was about to print in 1835 in Kirtland. So the document, which was canonized as Section 101 in 1835, which is now Section 111 in the Community of Christ's current Book of Doctrine and Covenants, reads, "We believe that all marriages in this Church of Christ," it's the church's original name, "this Church of Christ," and this is the other name that it has, Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints, "should be solemnized in a public meeting." So there may have been already here rumors that secret marriages were being performed, and so the document is very clear. No, you must have all marriages be solemnized in public. And then later on in the document it says, "Inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman but one husband, except in the case of death, when either is at liberty to marry again." So, in other words, we can't entirely tell what the fire is, but here's the smoke, which is the response of church members who do not like the fact that the church has been reproached with fornication, charges of fornication, and also already at this early time in 1835 of polygamy. Oliver Cowdery, as I said, he was a principal scribe for the Book of Mormon, the original second elder of the church, bitterly criticized Smith for engaging in what he called a dirty, nasty, filthy affair with Fanny Alger. The break between the two leaders caused Cowdery to leave the church's headquarters in Kirtland and relocate to the church's Missouri settlements. And then later, when Joseph Smith had to flee Kirtland and relocate to Missouri, he had him excommunicated in 1838. So in that trial in 1838, Cowdery refused to participate, but we have the minutes of the High Council talking about the trial and the testimony that was given. So in that 1838 trial, we read David W. Patton, who was one of the senior apostles, testifies that he went to Oliver Cowdery to inquire of him if a certain story was true respecting Joseph Smith's committing adultery with a certain girl, Fanny Alger. He, Cowdery, then went on and gave a history of some circumstances respecting the adultery scrape, stating no doubt it was true. He also said that Joseph told him that he had confessed to Emma. So that's from, again, the High Council minutes of Oliver Cowdery's excommunication trial in 1838. So according to that record, Joseph then gave, quote, gave a history respecting the girl business. So he apparently talked about the girl business to the members of the High Council. The High Council does not record any of the details of what that might be, but it was apparently enough to satisfy these loyalists who then went on to excommunicate Oliver Cowdery. Nevertheless, some of these loyalists who were voting to excommunicate Oliver Cowdery in the spring here of 1838, by the fall of 1838, they themselves will be out. And those include Thomas B. Marsh, the president of the 12, who would soon himself break with Smith over what Thomas Marsh felt were increasingly erratic and illegal activities in the Missouri Mormon War. But what I'm going to suggest here is getting rid of people like Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, all of the Whitmers. So by 1838, all of the non-Smith witnesses to the Book of Mormon had broken with Joseph Smith. Getting rid of Thomas Marsh, getting rid of critics, increasingly meant that Joseph Smith shed critical voices and encouraged around him uncritical voices, people who essentially were with him right or wrong, so yes men and so forth. And that's kind of already where we're at by 1838 as the Missouri Mormon War ends in horrible fiasco for church members, and they have to flee to Illinois, where they try one last time at Nauvoo. So all of that here that we've just gone through, this is just first drops prior to the flood. So if any of these anticipatory ideas and events were if that's all we had, what I've just laid out of things that happened up through 1838, this would be an interesting and perhaps even a compelling case, but it would, wouldn't really be conclusive. So historians, especially those with a Utah perspective, now argue that Fanny Alger was Joseph Smith's first wife. But the case can also be made that that was just an affair. So, in other words, this stuff, we don't have strong enough evidence that this would be a case that would achieve historical consensus. And indeed, there's a lot of arguing back and forth about just what happened with Fanny Alger, or whether there was any, what really was happening with the musing about the other polygamy things. All of that changes now in Nauvoo. So in Nauvoo, polygamy becomes a massive open secret. It's a secret, but it's impossible to keep secret. So beginning on April 5th, 1841 in Nauvoo, when Joseph Smith conducts his first set of what's going to be a whole set of sealings of women to himself in celestial marriage, Joseph Smith massively expanded the practice of celestial marriage, giving it the beginnings of a systematization. In no way is polygamy in Nauvoo ever become the kind of institution that it is when it's practiced for generations out in Utah and other places, but it has the beginnings of system. And Joseph Smith now also starts to create religious and other justifications, which he uses when he's teaching the practice secretly. So as we'll show, Joseph himself was sealed to dozens of women and girls, at least 27 of whom are very well documented. Actually, there's longer lists that a lot of historians will give. And he authorized other leaders to engage in the practice as well. So I want to look then, as we were talking about, at some of this evidence, this massive evidence for Joseph Smith's Nauvoo polygamy from each type of source. So we'll remember again here, we have testimony during Joseph Smith's life and testimony after Joseph Smith's death, but in both cases here, insiders who can remain loyal to Joseph Smith all their lives, and who later went with Joseph Smith III into the Reorganization after 1860. People who continued to believe in Joseph Smith all their lives, but followed Brigham Young after 1844. People who remained loyal to Joseph Smith all their lives, but who never joined Joseph Smith III and who were opponents of Brigham Young, people like my Benjamin Winchester, who I mentioned, one of my relatives, insiders who broke with Joseph Smith and left the movement. So anyway, so we'll look at all of those quadrants and find that, in fact, they largely all cohere. So in the first place, we talked about how, in terms of the actual publications that the church had during Joseph Smith's lifetime, there was a policy of secrecy. So Joseph Smith taught the doctrine secretly, and he swore those in the know to secrecy. But because the secret continually got out, Joseph Smith also issued public denials, which he felt were technically true, while they were nevertheless intending to deceive. So he wanted to deny that everybody was practicing polygamy without lying, technically, as he was trying to think, without perjuring himself anyway, while nevertheless making everybody think that they weren't practicing polygamy, which they were. So one of the ways that Joseph Smith would do that is by denouncing polygamy, in quotes, and spiritual wifery, because he argued privately that polygamy and spiritual wifery were Satan's counterfeit principle. These are abusive systems of God's true and everlasting principle of celestial marriage. And so what he's saying privately is that, yes, we are practicing celestial marriage, but that's not the counterfeit principle, polygamy and spiritual wifery. But he doesn't say that publicly. So in other words, publicly, he's denouncing polygamy and spiritual wifery without saying that they are a counterfeit principle. And so in other words, he's trying to nuance it, where he's technically pretending that he's not perjuring himself, while nevertheless intending to deceive regular hearers. And one of the ways that he justifies this kind of lying for the Lord is because it would damage the church. If people knew, people would be infuriated. It would cause, all hell to break loose, which it frankly did eventually. Okay, so whether that's perjury or not, there's an example, it's actually a much larger thing, where Joseph Smith said a whole long kind of non-denial denial, where he essentially calls William Law's charges that he was practicing adultery and polygamy and so forth, where he essentially tries to refute those without saying anything, without perjuring himself, right? So he says, for example, this new holy prophet, William Law, has gone to Carthage, the county seat where Nauvoo is, and sworn that I told him that I was guilty of adultery. This spiritual wifism, why a man dares not speak or wink for being accused of this. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can find but one, when I can only find one. So again, he's talking about how he's being accused of adultery and spiritual wifery, but he doesn't define those terms that way. In other words, and he's saying, I'm accused of having all these wives, I can only find one. So in other words, it's a non-denial denial where he's trying not to perjure himself, but nevertheless trying to make everyone publicly say, okay, no, I'm clearly not doing this, and so forth. Okay, so I want to show a couple examples of things that we do have. So even though there are those kinds of published public statements, we nevertheless do have contemporary documentation from Joseph Smith himself that actually illustrates a different narrative. And I just want to focus on one of the many women that Joseph Smith was involved with. We can't go through all the evidence of everything, but Sarah Ann Whitney. So according to, again, a later affidavit, and again, this was for someone who followed Brigham Young and became a Brighamite, but we'll talk about the contemporary evidence too. Sarah Ann Whitney was sealed to Joseph Smith on July 27th, 1842, at the age of 17, by her father, Newell K. Whitney, who was then the church's presiding bishop. So Joseph had already been sealed to more than a dozen women and girls by this time. But anyway, we want to look at this particular letter. So 3 weeks after the sealing, while Joseph Smith was hiding from Missouri sheriffs, he wrote to Sarah Ann and her parents, Newell K. Whitney and his wife. So what had happened is Joseph Smith, by all accounts, had his bodyguard, Porter Rockwell, maybe go and, at least as Porter Rockwell said, go and attempt to assassinate the former governor of Missouri, who is the person who'd given the exterminating order. That assassination attempt was botched, but nevertheless, Missouri sheriffs were trying to indict Joseph Smith and bring him back, extradite him to Missouri. And so he was hiding out from those attempts to be extradited. And so while he is away doing that, he writes a letter to the Whitneys. I take this opportunity to communicate some of my feelings privately at this time. This is in Joseph's own hand. It's a contemporary 1842 letter, which I want you three eternally to keep in your own bosoms. So you three, Sarah Ann and her parents, for my feelings are so strong for you since what has passed lately between us. And the sealing happened 3 weeks earlier. That the time of my absence from you seems so long, so dreary, and it seems as if I could not live long in this way. And if you three would come and see me in this lonely retreat, it would afford me great relief of mind if those with whom I am allied do love me. Now is the time to afford me succor in the days of exile. For you know, I foretold you of these things. I am now at Carlos Granger's, just back of Brother Hiram's farm. It is only 1 mile from town. The nights are very pleasant indeed. All three of you can come and see me in the forepart of the night. Let Brother Whitney come a little ahead and knock at the southeast corner of the house at the window. It is next to the cornfield. I have a room entirely by myself. The whole matter can be attended with the most perfect safety. I know it is the will of God that you should comfort me now in this time of affliction, and not at all. Now is the time or never. But I have no need of saying any such thing to you, for I know the goodness of your hearts, and that you will do the will of the Lord when it is made known to you. The only thing to be careful of is to find out when Emma comes. Then you cannot be safe. But when she is not here, then there is the most perfect safety. Only be careful to escape observation as much as possible. I know it is a heroic undertaking, but so much the greater friendship and the more joy. When I see you, I will tell you all my plans. I cannot write them on paper. Burn this letter as soon as you read it. Keep all locked up in your breasts. My life depends on it. One thing I want to see for you is to get the fullness of my blessing sealed upon our heads, etc. You will pardon me for my earnestness on this subject when you consider how lonesome I must be. Your good feelings know how to make every allowance for me. I close my letter. I think Emma won't come tonight. If she don't fail to come tonight, I subscribe myself your most obedient, affectionate companion and friend, Joseph Smith. So anyway, he wants to arrange, obviously, a tryst with Sarah Ann. He's lonely, and he's got to make sure that they don't get seen, and especially don't get seen by Emma, right? Okay. So, in addition to the letter in Joseph's hand here, we have a revelation document Joseph dictated prior to his sealing with Sarah Ann, where Newell K. Whitney acted as a scribe. And so in that document, written about 3 weeks earlier, we read, Verily, thus saith the Lord unto my servant Newell K. Whitney, the thing that my servant has made known to you and your family, and which you have agreed upon, is right in my eyes, and shall be rewarded upon your heads with honor and immortality and eternal life to all your house, both old and young, because of the lineage of my priesthood, saith the Lord. It shall be upon you and upon your children after you, from generation to generation, by virtue of the holy promise which I now make unto you, saith the Lord. These are the words which you shall pronounce This is again to Newell K. Whitney. These are the words that you shall pronounce upon my servant Joseph and your daughter Sarah Ann Whitney. They shall take each other by the hand, and you shall say, you both mutually agree, calling them by name, to be each other's companion, so long as you both shall live, preserving yourselves for each other and from all others, and also throughout eternity, reserving only those rights which have been given to my servant Joseph by revelation and commandment, and by legal authority in times past. If you both agree to covenant and do this, then I give you, Sarah Ann Whitney, my daughter, to Joseph Smith, to be his wife, to observe all those rights between you that belong to that condition. I do it in my own name, and in the name of my wife, your mother, and in the name of my holy progenitors, by the right of birth, which is of priesthood, vested in me by revelation and promise of the living God, obtained by holy Melchizedek, Jethro, and others of the holy fathers, commanding in the name of the Lord all those powers to concentrate in you and through you and your posterity forever. All these things I do in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that through this order he may be glorified, and through the power of anointing David may reign king over Israel, which shall hereafter be revealed. Let immortality and eternal life hereafter be sealed upon your heads forever and ever. Again, revelation given to Newell K. Whitney through Joseph the Seer, July 27th, 1842. So that's pretty clear, I would say, as a document. And I would say that this is the same kind of heavenly dynastic promise that Joseph Smith was making to many of his inner circle friends. So Newell K. Whitney, they'd been with right from the very beginning when he went to Kirtland, Newell K. Whitney's store. And he said, Newell K. Whitney, thou art the man, and so on. Now they're going to be sealed dynastically in heaven forever and ever, Newell K. Whitney and all of all of their generations, because Joseph Smith is going to be in this great prince in the hereafters and the highest degrees of glory in the celestial kingdom. And because he's sealed to Sarah Ann Whitney, the entire Whitney family is going to be part of that celestial clan. And that would have been the same kind of heavenly dynastic promise that Joseph Smith would have made to my own great-great-great-great-grandparents, Stephen and Nancy Winchester. So they had been friends for a whole long time. Stephen had been on the High Council, and he would again be on the High Council at Council Bluffs later. Anyway, and so as a result of that and those kind of promises, they gave their 14-year-old daughter, Nancy Mariah Winchester, to Joseph Smith to be a plural wife. So there are plenty of other documents from pro-Joseph Smith's sources during his lifetime. So Sarah Ann Whitney's and Nancy Mariah Winchester, those are just two of the 27 or so more of Joseph Smith's plural wives that are pretty well documented. There's other evidence by witnesses who remained loyal to Joseph Smith, and that includes people like his scribe, William Clayton, who was keeping Joseph Smith's official journals, but also who was a diary writer himself. And so he describes when Joseph Smith first taught him contemporaneously the doctrine of plural marriage. And so while people like the Whitneys and William Clayton later did follow Brigham Young, there were plenty of other witnesses who were opponents of Brigham Young. So one of those quadrants, like we talked about, are these contemporary exposés by members who left. I mentioned right at the start Ezra Booth, who maybe confirmed those musings about Lamanite polygamy that didn't come to anything. So there's plenty of these kinds of exposés in the past. Like I say, these were just always dismissed out of hand as being from apostates. But that's not how history works. How history works is we read the sources. We understand that all sources are written with their biases. We read them with their biases in mind. So some of the exposés, like for example, the one by Nauvoo Mayer, Joseph Smith's best friend for a short period of time anyway, and also though head of the university, general in the militia, special member of the first presidency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody who'd risen really high in Joseph Smith's good graces, and only to later, break with him. John C. Bennett had a very questionable character. His own biographer calls him a saintly scoundrel, and he's also himself certainly guilty of the practice, and so people can find that to be make him less believable and less credible. But nevertheless, he's actually, as an insider, very informed about the early practice. Many of the names that he gives are completely confirmed in pro-Joseph Smith sources and so forth. Nevertheless, not everybody who went apostate is a scoundrel like Bennett. There were others, for example, like Oliver Cowdery or like William Law, who continued to be great believers in the Restoration and who were appalled, in William Law's case, by Joseph personally teaching the doctrine to him, the principle to him, and which William Law rejected. William Law is one of the very famous members who came from the Toronto congregation here when it was first organized. Ultimately moved to Nauvoo, where he was a wealthy businessman, and again had become a member of the first presidency, very well respected. And when he objected to being taught polygamy, he felt the need to, when he couldn't fight it within the church, and when it was clear that it was going to continue to be practiced, he left the church in order to create a reform Mormon church, a reform Latter-day Saint tradition church. In other words, he's continued to be committed to the community and to the Restoration, but wanted to fight to purge these new doctrines and practices like polygamy out of it. And William Law, for example, one of the things that, in terms of background, one of his clerks, after the whole Nauvoo debacle, ended up moving back here to Toronto, and he was one of the old saints that had continued to exist all the way up until when the congregation was reorganized after the reorganized church happened, and as part of our continuity back to the very earliest part of the congregation in the 1830s. So anyway, okay, I want to talk a little bit about Emma's involvement with celestial marriage. So with one temporary exception, which we'll talk about, Emma was an ardent opponent of polygamy and celestial marriage. And I think she was still an opponent during that temporary exception, but was nevertheless capitulated for a brief time period. For this reason, Joseph Smith kept his early practice secret from Emma. It's pretty clear in that letter to Sarah Ann Whitney that he has not told Emma about Sarah Ann Whitney, right? Do not come if Emma's going to be here. If Emma's not around, then you can come. It's a perfect safety. I've got my own room. I'm so lonely. But if Emma's there, don't come, and so on. But even when Joseph Smith did decide to teach Emma the principle, when she did bring her in, she was initially very antagonistic to this, but ultimately, I'd say capitulated. Even when though it was at least that honest with her, he still massively deceived her about the extent of the practice and the number of women he was already involved with. That number included, again, 2 young kind of adopted daughters who were living in their household, who he had already secretly married. When Emma temporarily capitulated to this and selected them that they to be plural wives for Joseph in an entirely spiritual sense, she would have understood it. They essentially went through a sham resealing because they'd already sealed. So in other words, they were dishonest with Emma from start to finish on this. And for her to even do that brief capitulation, she got some pretty strong sauce. And so on July 12th, 1843, Smith dictated a so-called revelation commanding the practice of celestial marriage, which included specific threats to Emma. And we read, essentially, thus saith the Lord, let my handmaid, Emma Smith, receive all of those wives that have been given unto my servant Joseph, for I am the Lord thy God, and ye shall obey my voice, and I give unto my servant Joseph that he shall be made ruler over many things, for he hath been faithful over a few things, and from henceforth I will strengthen him. And I command mine handmaid Emma Smith to abide and cleave unto my servant Joseph, and to none else. So it's not a two-way polygamy. But if she will not abide by this commandment, she shall be destroyed, saith the Lord. For I am the Lord thy God, and will destroy her if she abide not my law. And we have recollections from Emma's friends later who said that Emma, we talked to her about this, and she said, well, I have to submit or be destroyed. And obviously this is potentially spiritual destruction, of course, but there's all kinds of other ways of destroyed. We had mentioned how a destroying angel had arguably gone to go attempt to assassinate the Missouri governor and so forth. So anyway, threatened with destruction, whatever God, if we wanted to say that that's God, whatever Joseph Smith's voicing God in this way means, and deceived by Joseph as to the extent of the practice, like I say, Emma temporarily acquiesced and agreed to allow Joseph to be sealed secretly to a few young women before resuming her ardent opposition to polygamy. So we'll talk about some of the accounts from insiders who did not align with Joseph Smith. So, for example, William Marks, this is his recollection that was published in 1860 of events at the end of 1844. This is from the very first issue of the True Latter-day Saints Herald. This is the publication of Community of Christ that has been ongoing ever since 1860, the longest continuously published periodical in the Restoration movement. So in the very first issue, William Marks wrote, Brother Isaac Sheen is the editor of the Herald. I feel desirous to communicate through your periodical a few suggestions made manifest to me by the Spirit of God in relation to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, by which he actually means Community of Christ here, the RLDS Church, and actually the original church. About the 1st of June, 1844, situated as I was at that time, being presiding elder of the stake of Nauvoo, and by appointment presiding officer of the High Councils, in other words, one of the top leaders of the church, co-equal in rank to the president of the Council of 12, I had a very good opportunity to know the affairs of the church. And my convictions at that time were that the church, in a measure, had departed from the pure principles and doctrines of Jesus Christ. So from his own experience as the leader of the High Council, the church has departed from pure principles. I felt much troubled in my mind about the condition of the church. I prayed earnestly to my Heavenly Father to show me something in regard to it. When I was wrapped in vision, it was shown me by the Spirit that the top or branches had overcome the root in sin and wickedness, and that the only way to cleanse and purify it, the church that is, was to disorganize it, and in due time the Lord would reorganize it again. So this is the original narrative of the reorganization had. A few days after this occurrence, I met with Brother Joseph. This is Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of the church, not Joseph III. It's back in 1844. I met with Brother Joseph, who said he wanted to converse with me on the affairs of the church, and we retired by ourselves. I will give you his words verbatim, for they are indelibly stamped on my mind. He said he had desired for a time to have a talk with me on the subject of polygamy. He said it eventually would prove the overthrow of the church, and that we should soon be obliged to leave the United States unless it could speedily be put down. He was satisfied that it was a cursed doctrine, and that there must be every exertion made to put it down. He said that he would go before the congregation and proclaim against it, and I must go to the High Council, and he would prefer charges against those in transgression, and I must sever them from the church unless they made ample satisfaction. All right, so in other words, from this vantage point in the High Council, William Marks had actually been present when Joseph Smith taught the doctrine to the High Council, and so William Marks knew that the church had departed from pure principles. But later, Joseph Smith changed his mind and wanted to eliminate the practice, and he was presumably getting ready with William Marks to get scapegoats like he'd done before with John C. Bennett in order to cut them off. So maybe round up people like Brigham Young and so forth, bring them on charges and throw them to the wolves in order to pretend or maybe to actually get rid of the practice of polygamy. So we kind of are summing up our Nauvoo timeline. Just maybe we want to put all of what we've even just been talking about into a little chronological context. So this is taking us from 1841 to 1844. And if we start left to right, in 1841, Joseph Smith has a celestial marriage ceremony with Louisa Beeman. So initiating this practice of sealing in Nauvoo, which is so much more, let's say, expansive and systematic than anything he'd done before. In February 17th, 1842, the Nauvoo City Council sets 14 as the legal age for women to marry, hopefully coincidentally. Anyway, on April 10th, 1842, Joseph Smith's proposition to Nancy Rigdon, Sidney Rigdon's daughter, is rejected. That causes a rift with Sidney Rigdon, who continues to be an anti-polygamist for the rest of his tenure in the Latter-day Saint movement, and so the Rigdonite Church is opposed to polygamy. In 1842, June of 1842, John C. Bennett is expelled from Nauvoo as a scapegoat for polygamy. He then goes on a tour and publishes exposés and so forth. In May 23rd, 1843, Emma acquiesces on these limited celestial marriages. In January of 1844, William Law is taught the principle and rejects celestial marriage when he's told about it by Hiram Smith. April of 1844, having not been able to work inside to get them to stop, the Laws leave and found the Reform Mormon movement. In June 10th, Joseph and the City Council destroy the Reformed Church's newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor, which brings out all of their secrets and indeed is quite well informed about the practice that is happening. The City Council's move is illegal and unconstitutional. It's a suppression of freedom of the press. It causes a national scandal. In late June of 1844, according to William Marks, Joseph Smith decides that celestial marriage will ruin the church. He burns his temple garments, and in 1844, the same June of 1844, Joseph and Emma burn the celestial marriage revelation, according to Isaac Sheen and other testimony and so forth. So this is a course reversal, it sounds like, at the very end, this testimony of William Marks, Isaac Sheen, and so forth. According to Todd Compton, who's written one of the really best books on this subject, it's called In Sacred Loneliness, and it talks about biographies and evidence about all of the plural wives of Joseph Smith. According to Todd Compton, in the last 6 months of Joseph Smith's life, he actually wasn't taking any additional plural wives, so he might have himself decided that this practice was going to be the ruin of everything, like he apparently told William Marks. As we say, Isaac Sheen and others say that Joseph and Emma burned the original document of that polygamy revelation, which said that Emma would be destroyed if she doesn't submit. Unfortunately, a copy, well, fortunately for history, but fortunately for historians, not necessarily for history in Utah, a copy was kept by William Clayton, again, that secretary. Like I say, Joseph also put off his endowment garments and told others to do likewise. So, nevertheless, he was killed. The secret was too much, and there were so many other things going on that it couldn't be walked back. The next quadrant that we have of evidence is all of the people who continue to be believers in the Restoration, who continue to be in favor of supporters of Joseph Smith even after his death, but who were anti-Brigham Young, and yet they nevertheless were polygamists. So For the old RLDS narrative that Brigham Young is the founder of all of polygamy, it's very difficult to explain someone like Lyman Wight, who frankly refused to follow Brigham Young, didn't recognize Brigham Young had any claim or authority at all. Lyman Wight had been more important than Brigham Young in the early movement. He was the leader of Zion's camp, very much outranking Brigham Young and so forth. And he was leader of the church in Adirondack, Daviess County, the county north of Far West, the church headquarters during the Mormon-Missouri War. Also, Lyman Wight was present when Joseph Smith was awaiting trial for treason in Liberty Jail, when Joseph Smith Jr. gave a special blessing. Joseph Smith III was visiting there, and Joseph III prophesied that his son would one day be his successor as prophet. Wight testified that that had occurred, that he was a witness of that, and that was part of his beliefs. And so he found Brigham Young's claims to be baseless and a usurpation. Nevertheless, even though Wight continued to believe that Joseph III, when he grew older, would one day be prophet, Wight and his faction had been taught celestial marriage by Joseph Smith and not by Brigham Young, and the Wightites practiced polygamy in their settlements in Texas. So despite the differences between Wight's group and the later Reorganization, because of Wight's belief that Joseph III would be the next prophet, most of the Wightites followed Joseph III into the Reorganization and ultimately abandoned polygamy. And indeed, in the Community of Christ today, the president of our Presidents of 70, one of our leadership councils, John Wight, is a direct descendant of Lyman Wight. So the Wightites maintain themselves in the church today. Another of I'm missing one. Oh, didn't add a slide. Another one was Alphaeus Cutler. So anyway, Alphaeus Cutler is another one who also broke with Joseph Smith, took 6 wives and so forth. We'll skip Alphaeus Cutler and go on here to James Strang. So as of Joseph Smith's death in 1844, James Strang was essentially an outsider. He was a member of the church. He'd been ordained and so on, but he was living essentially in one of the branches in Wisconsin. And so he had not been aware of the internal practices. He was only aware of the church's public denunciations of polygamy. So his faction of the church initially was therefore quite anti-polygamy. But by 1849, his faction had emerged as by far and away the most successful rival to Brigham Young. So Sidney Rigdon's church, mostly disintegrated and so on. And as a result, and very few people followed Lyman Wight relatively, and as a result, most everybody who wasn't following Brigham Young at a certain point was following Strang. And so having attracted a huge number of Nauvoo insiders to his own banner, James Strang was eventually convinced that, yes, okay, Joseph Smith did practice polygamy. He had seen enough evidence and enough testimony of that he himself changed his position by 1849. He received a revelation, and then his church began practicing polygamy openly, much to the chagrin of former members across the Midwest in the branches who continued to be opponents of polygamy. So another pro-Joseph Smith, anti-Brigham Young polygamist leader was Joseph Smith's brother, William Smith. The last surviving of the Smith brothers, he briefly affiliated both first with Brigham Young's faction and then later with James Strang's faction, before being kicked out of both because very hard guy to get along with, very, very much sure of his own place and how he should be given lots and lots of respect as the last big Smith. And so he began organizing his own faction of a church, a Williamite church, in a place called Palestine Grove in Lee County, Illinois. That town doesn't exist. When the railways went through, the town settlement moved to the nearby town of Amboy, which becomes important in 1860, as we'll see. So William gained support from leaders who believed in lineal succession, in other words, that the next leader of the church should be a Smith. So people like Lyman Wight, who temporarily made kind of an alliance with William Smith. And he was also attracted a bunch of leaders who were opponents of polygamy, like publisher Isaac Sheen, who was the publisher of William Smith's church's newspaper, the Aaronic and Melchizedek Herald. Isaac Sheen, as we saw, later went on to be the publisher of the Saints Herald, in other words, the RLDS paper. And other people who joined were Jason Briggs, a former Strangite who was opposed to polygamy, a person who William Smith ordained to be an apostle. He later became the first apostle of the Reorganization. So ironically, however, while William was following his brother's practice of publicly denying polygamy, so he was attracting people like Isaac Sheen and Jason Briggs, but he was secretly practicing celestial marriage, just like his brother had. So this was discovered when William got threatened with prosecution for statutory rape, for marrying an underage follower. And so he had to flee his headquarters in Lee County. And as we know, then that later becomes the site of the 1860 reorganization. And so effectively, William Smith's church, the anti-polygamy components of it, the Amboy headquarters, Isaac Sheen, the publisher, and so forth, the new organization of the church that became the reorganization had been William's church, having gotten rid of William because they were opposed to polygamy. So if we follow this kind of timeline past the martyrdom of Joseph Smith in 1844, so in 1846, Strang was still in a place where he was denouncing polygamy. In 1847, William Smith had become part of Strang's church, but got excommunicated by Strang for practicing polygamy. By 1849, Strang began practicing polygamy. By 1850, Isaac Sheen caught William Smith at polygamy, and he has to, again, escape for the statutory rape claim and leave his own church. In 1851, Jason Briggs, a former Williamite apostle, and Zenas Curley Sr., former Strangite, they received their revelations that begin the process of creating a new organization of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the first conference of which happens in 1852, the same moment when the Brighamites finally openly admit the practice. They have continuously been following Joseph Smith's policy of keeping the practice secret and publicly denouncing it while practicing it in secret. Now the game changes for the Brighamites anyway, not for anybody else. Oh, I'm sorry. 1853 is another case. This is the case where William Smith actually has to run away from his church for statutory rape, polygamy. He'd been caught earlier by Isaac Sheen. Two different incidents. All right. And then in 1856, James Strang is martyred on Beaver Island by disgruntled former members of his own faction of the church. In part, they're upset because of his open practice of polygamy, but lots of other things too. Okay, so in sum of this evidence part, we just have massive evidence for Joseph Smith's Nauvoo practice of polygamy from every quadrant of these sources. So I barely have had, this is a long lecture, and I've barely had time to share even the tiniest fraction of the evidence, and really our sources cohere despite the fact that they have competing interests. It's simply the old RLDS narrative that polygamy is some kind of conspiracy founded by Brigham Young that Joseph Smith was fighting is simply untenable, because people in 3 of these 4 quadrants are not Brigham Young fans, and yet their stories cohere. Again, everyone from Isaac Sheen and William Marks in the RLDS quadrant who who did we have? We had the Lyman White and everybody, and Benjamin Winchester in the the non-RLDS and anti-Brigham Young quadrant, and everybody like Oliver Cowdery and William Law and so many others in the hate Brigham Young, also left the movement during Joseph Smith's lifetime quadrant. Okay, so how did the RLDS Church get to a place where an incorrect understanding of history became almost a faith tenet, certainly became an identity narrative? So as we said, Joseph Smith had secretly been practicing celestial plural marriage while maintaining a public policy of condemning polygamy. We've said again, Emma was deceived by her husband about the extent of his practice and continued his policy of publicly denying and condemning polygamy. Although she rarely did so very publicly, and we do not have her own written words about it. as I say, we have hearsay testimony that Joseph III took down through his own prism as how he understood what he might have wanted to say. And if he was saying things like, did you ever have any, was your husband ever married to anybody but one wife? And if she said he only ever had one wife, which is me, kind of thing, that is legally true. So that is more true than the dissembling kind of sayings that Joseph Smith had been doing when he was condemning polygamy but claiming secretly there's a plural marriage. These are not legitimate wives. Whatever we can, if they maybe have a celestial component to them, if you believe it or not, certainly Emma and Joseph III don't believe that. And so, if anything, that those do not qualify, right? So, by contrast, though, Joseph III was fervent, as opposed to his father, Joseph III was fervently opposed to polygamy and spent much of his life pushing to end its practice in Utah. So he was actually very active in politically campaigning to get the U.S. federal government to use all of its power to stamp out polygamy as a practice. So here is Joseph III's nuanced understanding of polygamy. He says this in his inaugural address as prophet and president of the church, given at a general conference of the church at William Smith's old headquarters, nearby the headquarters in Amboy, Illinois, on April 6, 1860. Joseph III stated, "There is but one principle taught by leaders of any faction of this people that I hold in utter abhorrence, and that's a principle taught by Brigham Young and those believing in him. I have been told that my father taught such doctrines. I have never believed it and never can believe it. If such things were done, then I believe they were never done by divine authority. I believe my father was a good man, and a good man could never have promulgated such doctrines." So again, Joseph III was an 11-year-old boy. He was not an insider. This is not a eyewitness account in any sense. This is a statement of a person's personal belief. This personal belief is, even though he's been told by lots of people, actually it turns out, and he's going to get told by a lot more, that his father taught these doctrines, he's nevertheless asserting, I've never believed it and I can never believe it. So that's just a decision on his part. If such things were done, he admits, then I believe they were never done by divine authority. And by the way, that's my position too. So I do not consider any of this to be revelations. I consider this to be abuses of priesthood power and other kinds of authority. So if it were done, which it was actually, then Joseph III admits that was not, if it were, then he would say that's not done by divine authority. And then he goes on to say, I believe my father's a good man. Well, we would all love to believe that our fathers are good men. My father, I think, is a good man. Anyway, but I believe that. So maybe other people know my dad and don't like him. But anyway, I believe my father was a good man, he says. And he says a good man never could have promulgated such doctrines. Well, the reality is we have the evidence his father did promulgate such doctrines, and that just is going against his own personal vision of a pious son whose father was killed when he was 11 years old, and so on. All right. So this is where Joseph is coming from. And nevertheless, the statement is incredibly nuanced. It's not just, I have all of the evidence. I can tell you for sure that he was not, that Joseph Smith, my father, was not a polygamist. Okay. So Joseph III's nuance is lost in translation, although Joseph III had this nuanced position. If such things were done, they were never done by divine authority. His sons, Frederick Madison Smith, Israel A. Smith, and W. Wallace Smith, the next three prophets and presidents of the RLDS Church, didn't hear that kind of nuance. They weren't privy to the kind of information. They hadn't heard all of these insiders, including ultimately Joseph III interviewed directly many of his father's plural wives. So they didn't have any of that kind of actual information that is behind the nuance that Joseph III have. They just have their dad's testimony, which if you're not listening for the nuance, you don't hear the nuance. So anyway, no one promulgated the tradition of absolving Joseph Smith Jr. in bad faith. So they believed the testimony of their grandfather, that the testimony that their grandfather was a good man. So Fred M., Israel A., W. Wallace, their dad said that. so they believed their dad's testimony that their grandfather was a good man, and consequently could not have been responsible for promulgating a serious abuse of priesthood authority as if it were a revelation. And so when they taught that to members of the church, that's what members of the church understood. But none of that was based on history. None of that is based on any kind of historical evidence or anything. Again, when the historical evidence is examined and weighed, it's not only just overwhelming. There's really almost no counter argument that can even be made, which is why, as Grant McMurray said, no credible historian argues at all that Joseph Smith was not engaged in polygamy. So that's the goals as we had set them forth, and we've covered each one of those. Do have some goals going forward. So in my view, much of the past half-century of restoration history has involved applying the academic discipline of history to our sacred stories, our identity myths, with the inevitable result of deconstruction of traditional narratives when we find out that stories we've told are not history. They may have some truth in them. The truth is not that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist. The truth is that members of the Reorganization were fervent in their opposition to polygamy going all the way back to Kirtland. Now, there was people in one faction of the church who did not believe in this, so they opposed it, and that included Emma and Joseph III especially. So there are reasons why. So a lot of people now will say, well, polygamy, if it's consenting adults, and consenting adults should do whatever they can, whatever they want. But there's a reason why, for example, in Canada, religious polygamy is against the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, is because inevitably when sexist polygamy, polygyny, where there's one man and multiple women, is practiced, it is inevitably to the detriment of women, and so women lose anything remotely close to co-equal personhood. Whenever there's polygamy that happens, what happens is a couple men, the patriarchs, the leaders of the system, end up at old age having lots and lots of young wives. The marrying age for girls goes inevitably down. And so I mentioned even already in Joseph Smith's time, Nauvoo, the Nauvoo City Council set the marrying age for girls at 14, and both my great aunt Nancy Mariah Winchester and one other of the girls, Helen Mar Whitney, Kimball, were both 14. So that's 14, and that continues in the Restoration, where there are many of the polygamist churches, there are underage marriages. For example, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, their prophet Warren Jeffs is, in serving prison time for these kinds of abuses right at this point. So marrying age for women goes down. Women are no longer in a relationship of equals. They're more in a grandfather kind of relationship, or at least daughter-father relationship. The power dynamic is all messed up. And so that's why, anyway, there is more to this than just, well, whatever. And even if you agree to 18-year-olds that you're going to cut it off, which they sometimes can, this can still the same result kind of happens. Okay, that's so that's what I'm saying is an actual truth that's behind this, just like there was an actual truth behind the breaking up the China to make Kirtland Temple story. But debunking shouldn't be the goal. So too often, I think, a lot of times people want to use history in order to, knock people over the head and destroy some of their cherished narratives and things like that. Hopefully we can get past that. We spent, like I say, a past half century in the Restoration doing this kind of deconstruction. So I hope our goal going forwards in overcoming our inherited bias for historicity. So we should just stop thinking of saying, oh, is that true? And have that mean did that happen in history? True is not the same as history. And in the same way, is the Book of Mormon true? That people mean that as if is the Book of Mormon actual historical account. Of course it's not. That's not how any scripture is. So truth is not the same as history, and history is not the same as truth. We have this crazy bias for historicity. So we need to get past that and instead look for actual truth and meaning in narrative so that we are finally able to construct responsible histories that can then inform new sacred identity stories. And we came a long way to get here, but that is my case for describing and understanding Joseph Smith and the origins of Latter-day Saint tradition polygamy. And so we'll see if there have been any comments or questions in the whole course of this. There may well have been. I'll ask Leandro, and I'm going to get a glass of water. It's Benjamin. Oh yeah, Bob Garrison, right? Yes. Okay, so Bob Garrison writes, what took so long for the policy on the participation of people of African descent in the LDS Church? Wow, there were a bunch of liberal Mormons who were asking that for a while. But on the other hand, it's really difficult for there to be any forward political change in the LDS Church. So part of the issue for the LDS Church is the succession crisis. So in the very same way that we in Community of Christ in the RLDS Church got locked into a kind of a policy of kind of lineal descent. Okay. Oh, I see. Got locked into a policy of lineal descent in our succession. In other words, so after Joseph Jr., the next prophet is Joseph III, then Israel A. Smith, Frederick M. Smith, Israel A. Smith, W. Wallace B. Smith. In other words, Smith family stuff. And we only escaped from that in the 1990s. The LDS Church has never escaped from its succession claim. And so Brigham Young didn't actually have a very good claim, if any kind, to be the next leader. He claimed it on the basis of being one of the senior leader of one of the leadership councils. And so given that was his only basis for a claim, or he made that it be his claim, thereafter, every successor in the LDS Church has always been the senior-most member of the Council of 12, or the Quorum of 12, as they call it. And so as a result of that, they're just really old, and they've been really old throughout, all through the 20th century. And so they are not prepared to, they're not flexible, they're not forward-thinking or anything like that, and they all have to kind of agree. So you need 15 old white guys to get through that. And so the only reason why the LDS Church actually made the change was they were facing just enormous social pressure. There was a big chance that they would be, if that had continued into the 80s, if you think of the kind of pressure that was that South Africa had for apartheid and things like that, the kind of pressure that the Mormon Church would have been facing to abandon that that policy would have been kind of unbearable. BYU wouldn't have been able to play any sports, and that's kind of like almost the biggest consideration that they have. And so they capitulated, just like they did when they gave in on polygamy as a really last resort in the early 1890s. But really, with those two exceptions of buckling in the face of overwhelming political pressure, there's been almost no willingness or capacity to make changes in the LDS Church because of their gerontocracy, their system of absolute rule by this very, very old guy. Mark Tensmeyer, what explanation do you have for the lack of children from Joseph and a plural wife? So unlike how polygamy becomes an institution and becomes justified in the Brighamite Church in Utah, where they are more or less claiming that one of the reasons they're doing this is that they need to rapidly colonize Utah, and that a lot of men had been killed and so on, and they need to marry the widows, otherwise nobody will take care of widows unless you're married to them, or other strange ideas like that. They had one of the reasons that they're going to have more children, and so that becomes a justification for polygamy in the Brighamite tradition. It actually isn't true, because polygamist women, as a group, don't actually have any more children on average. They actually have less children on average than monogamous, similar number of monogamous women, and so actually, as a result of that, it doesn't work out. What happens is a couple guys like Brigham Young, who have 50 wives, have an enormous number of descendants. There are lots and lots of people who are descendants of Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, because they were had so many wives, each one of them. But Joseph Smith was clearly not, because when we can tell because of the not having children, Joseph Smith was clearly not going for that. And in fact, I would argue, why isn't there much? Because he is actively trying to keep the practice a secret. He doesn't want there to be kids. In the case that we had, I read that whole long thing about Sarah Ann Whitney. So one of the things that Joseph Smith did, and we have more testimony of this, he arranges a kind of a sham wedding for her and a guy who'd been, again, another loyalist who had been Newell K. Whitney's clerk. And the guy very much has an affidavit that he knew that this was not the real marriage, because Joseph Smith was really married to her. But it was in case, she did get pregnant, it would be understood to be his, right? And so in some cases, Joseph Smith was using the screen of the fact that these women had other husbands in order to, in case they did get pregnant, that would be explained. And so he's actively trying to not have children, and so there were other means of birth control that were possible even in the 1840s, and we have at least two of them that were, for example, when John C. Bennett is scapegoated. So there's three of those kind of 1840s kinds of birth control that were, not ineffective, some cases very effective, that in fact they charged that Bennett was doing. And so those are, there was still, a kind of, primitive condom. There is not having non-vaginal sex, and there is abortion. And all three of those were charged that Bennett was doing those. So anyway, there might have been some kind of birth control. There might have been other. He was not trying to have kids. Bob Garrison, how do polygamy groups active today trace their beliefs back to Joseph Smith? Because he dictated a revelation on it, and they have continued to. They've continued to consider themselves to be his successor. So when that revelation happens, it's called the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. And so the idea of it is it can't be revoked. And so the idea is that later successors, most of them trace their lineage through Brigham Young and then John Taylor. John Taylor purportedly had a revelation that said that where God said, "How can I God break an everlasting covenant?" Therefore, if the church is forced by the federal government essentially to stop practicing it, it'll be in apostasy, and so therefore it'll be important for members of the priesthood to continue to practice the principle, and so many of those groups trace their lineage that way. Benjamin, could John speak to how Joseph Campbell, the Campbellite Church, I think it means Alexander Campbell, we should just be saying here, how the Campbellite Church of Christ relates to the greater Restoration movement? So yes, the Alexander Campbell is a contemporary of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon is actually, before he joins Joseph Smith's church and combines his church with Joseph Smith's church, is actually an important leader in the Campbellite Church. Both of these churches actually have their name. They're called Church of Christ because they're both trying to do the same thing, which is to restore what they were called primitive Christianity, what we might call the ancient church of Christ and the apostles. So the church, as they understood it, having read the book of Acts and imagining the book of Acts is history, which I would actually say is not very good history. It probably doesn't describe actual history, but nevertheless is scripture that talks about the early church and was a model for restorationists, people who, like Alexander Campbell and Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith, wanted to restore the way Christians first understood the church. And so it's a broad idea of movements that are happening in the time period, the Second Great Awakening in North America and England, and so they relate directly in the fact that one of the effective co-founders of the Latter-day Saint Restoration, Sidney Rigdon, had been an important leader actually in the Stone Campbell Restoration movement. Dave Donahue asked, how are the terms sealing and celestial marriage being defined? So celestial marriage, it would, I guess, be the overall doctrine or concept, and then a sealing is essentially the act of doing it, or the ceremony of doing it, the ordinance of doing it. And so we read in that revelation that, or purported revelation that Joseph Smith dictated to Newell K. Whitney, was in fact a sealing ceremony, was actually described, where God was authorizing Newell K. Whitney to perform the sealing, and what exactly they should do, and how they should, what the rules, what Joseph Smith should say, what the parents should say, and so on, the covenant that they were both making. So that would be the sealing, and then once they are sealed together, that what they have is a celestial marriage. That's how I guess I would define it. In terms of, at this point, what did celestial marriage necessarily mean? It is not a situation where, like Joseph Smith in the mansion house, they had a big hotel wing and all of the wives moved in there. Certainly Emma wouldn't have allowed that. It largely, it is not like it's practiced later in Utah where, kind of openly, Mormon patriarchs have a bunch of wives and they either are in a kind of a giant oversized houses together like Brigham Young's compound, or in some of the cases they or some of the sister wives together have independent properties where they almost are like widows who the patriarch comes and visits every once in a while and they're kind of semi-independent. In this case, most of these women were either continuing to live with their actual husbands or their parents, or they're single in some way. So Mark Tensmeyer, related to David's question, what did you say the theory was, that these were, what do you say to the theory that these are platonic sealings and not marriages? Um, so, so when I say that that there's a total historical consensus that that Joseph Smith is involved in polygamy, that doesn't mean that some of the nuance is arguable. So different historians do make different arguments. I don't know that anybody makes the argument that they're all purely spiritual. Maybe they do. Certainly, Brian Hales is, I think, major proponent of Joseph Smith didn't have sex with the underage girls and with the women who were married to other men. I don't know if he means that he didn't have sex with anybody. One of the things that we do have, so one of the points, the negative evidence that people point to is all of the genetic tests where women who had been married or sealed to Joseph Smith and had a child, and who named the child like Josephine or something like that, and who told the child later even that they understood the child to be Joseph's child, and so on. All of the cases where there have been a DNA test have shown that those are not, in fact, Joseph Smith's children, or the descendants of those people. And so that's a kind of a negative argument in term that people, or negative evidence that is made. And so that's in favor of that, in favor of that idea. But the problem with that is the women know how babies are made. and so even if it isn't Joseph Smith's child, and if they thought it was, then they maybe know how, why they would have that misimpression, right? And there are plenty of, so because Joseph III took this extreme position that so many people knew was not correct firsthand, there was an insane amount of firsthand affidavits, including from women, some cases in court cases under oath, for example, in the Temple Lot case, women not only from the Brighamite Church, but Strangites and so on, other different groups who nevertheless testified, within the realm of the niceties of the Victorian age, that they were married to Joseph Smith in all ways, and so there was a lot of testimony that some of those unions are sexual. So I think it would be a very extreme position to try to make them entirely all purely spiritual wifery, which was again a term that anyway Joseph Smith was opposed to. If you are a person in one of the Brighamite tradition churches, if you're in the LDS Church and you're making the claim that Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy was purely non-sexual, I don't know what case you're making about then your own tradition, Brigham Young. So Brigham Young, clearly his practice of polygamy is sexual. So did he pervert the system? Are you following in an apostate church? If that's your argument, I'm always just surprised that the next logical conclusion of that isn't always thought out. Anyway, so. Okay, Ikaramba asks, is there any indication in the historical record that Joseph ever used the concubine allowance that is made in D&C 132? Do you think it's likely that he had more sexual partners than we know of? So I do think it's likely that that there are many more undocumented cases that we don't know about, because it's just a very widespread practice for him, and we try to keep, historians try to be very clear and keep the list fairly clean, where we say, okay, well, there's a bunch of these other rumors. There's there's rumors that he took a plural wife when he's visiting, like I say, my great uncle Benjamin Winchester, when Benjamin Winchester was the stake president of Philadelphia, the largest Eastern stake, and so on. But that one's not widely attested. It's kind of a rumor, right? And so that doesn't make it onto the list of the ones that are attested. So yes, I think there probably were. In terms of the clauses of D&C 132, so D&C 132 for people in the LDS Church, the LDS Doctrine and Covenants 132. This is that polygamy revelation that I quoted from, where where God says that Emma is going to be destroyed if she doesn't submit. In general, Joseph Smith does not follow the rules of that. So, in as much as that's a revelation from God, he is in total, he's transgressed it, because it clearly says that he's supposed to tell Emma about every one of these marriages, and he's not doing that. The clause in DNC 132, LDS DNC 132, is that she doesn't get to say anything more. She can give her consent. If she doesn't consent, then he can still do it. He can override her veto. She doesn't have a veto, but she has to be informed so that she can choose to give consent or not, even though he overrides it. So I would say, is he using the clauses? I don't think he's following the rules of that revelation at all. Daryl Scott writes, was 14 widely considered too young to marry at a time like it is now? So there have been long apologetic articles on this. In general, the answer is yes, sort of, depending on how you're looking at it. Certainly for an older man like Joseph Smith, yes. So if, in as much as you are very low social class, you're on the extremes, you are talking about marriages between, let's say, a 14-year-old girl and a 17-year-old boy or something like that, it's not unheard of. It is still relatively rare. For anybody, it definitely could be considered a very low-class thing to do for anybody anywhere civilized in North America. In other words, in the city and not on the extreme frontier. Nauvoo is sort of frontiery, but nevertheless, it's tough. It's not a common practice. So the marrying age by Todd Compton did a study for this, and Craig Foster did one too, and shows that it is possible. And so, in other words, it's not like it didn't happen, but in terms of it's such an extreme minority of people that are getting married at that age, and certainly not usually not in this with this kind of an age range and difference between the 14-year-old and the older man. Michelangelo Sanchez says, are there other examples or cases of polygamy in America before or after, outside the church, I mean? Were other groups influenced by Smith's practice, Young's practice, and so forth? So there were a bunch of different marrying experiments that were going on in the Second Great Awakening, including experiments like, for example, with kind of like a Christian colony, a free love kind of colony, where everybody is everybody's spouse and nobody has nobody is supposed to be proprietary over the children who are the children of the community, and so forth. And so there were definitely different kinds of marrying experiences going on, experiments going on. There were also religious groups like the Shakers that were wholly celibate and so forth. And when that happens, of course, it's hard to reproduce, and they're mostly died out at this point. But so there are different things that were happening. I don't know how much the Mormon practice of polygamy influenced other groups to become polygamists, but it is something that happens a lot in let's say, new religious groups, what some people might call cults outside of the Restoration tradition. So inside the Restoration tradition, it happens all the time. It doesn't take very long if you start a Book of Mormon study group, and you're all in private or whatever together, and a year later, your wife is a leader of the group's wife, and so on. So in other words, it's a danger of this kind of happening. I'm taking that very, very much too lightly, but anyway, that it's certainly something that happens within the tradition, but it can happen in new religious traditions all the time, where there's a charismatic leader. It's one of the things that happen, whether or not Joseph Smith and Brigham Young have any influence on it. John Johnson says, what do you think of Joseph Fielding Smith's tract replying to RLDS and plural marriage? I wasn't persuaded, but I would like feedback. Just curious. So I haven't read Joseph Fielding Smith's tract anytime recently. What I'll say is that so Joseph, I'm presuming it's Joseph F. Smith's tract. He's got the same name, Joseph Fielding Smith. Essentially, Hiram's son is president of the LDS Church at the same time as Joseph III's is president of Community of Christ. And so they're first cousins, and they are just horrible enemies. Joseph F. Smith was caused to, when Joseph Smith III went around Utah and tried to gather people back into the reorganization and so forth, Joseph F. Smith was sent by Brigham Young to go around and dog him to kind of more or less show, well, we've got Smiths too, and so on. And they were very bitter. Certainly Joseph F. Smith. This is his family, right? So we don't matter whether we agree with it or not. He's got all of these wives and all of these kids and so on. And Joseph III, also just considers that to be, not just a horrible abuse and not an acceptable moral thing to be doing. So, yeah. So Daryl Scott asks, is Community of Christ still against consensual polygamy? I would have expected such a liberal denomination to accept it. So what I was talking about it before, I was actually talking about Canada and Canada's policy in terms of where we're at, which is a little different from the United States position on like Bill of Rights stuff as opposed to Charter of Human Liberties stuff. The story is a little bit interesting in terms of when Community of Christ and the LDS Church started doing international missionary work and getting converts, for example, in Africa and India, places where there's traditional practice of polygamy. So this became a kind of a major issue in the 1960s and 70s, kind of for both churches. And in a kind of an ironic twist, the LDS Church, which had been the proponents of polygamy, now that they are anti-polygamy, their policy was that you can't be baptized unless you break the families up. And so that's kind of their policy. Community of Christ policy was, no, you can't abandon these women and children to, and throw them off. But you can join, but then take no more additional wives. And so that's how kind of the church related to that. In terms of consensual polygamy in the Western world, we are still opposed to that. Yes. So this is a part of an ongoing. We are still in our own discernment about human sexuality and things like that, but we uphold monogamy as the church policy. That's it. Well, we'll leave it on that note. Thank you so very much. Like I say, we wanted to go through this case because I think it's critically important as we make new identity stories for us that we're informed by the evidence of history, especially when there is a historical consensus like this, and yet nevertheless understand that when we have inherited stories and understandings like this, where they came from, not to think, not to feel betrayed or feel like you've been deceived, or also feel like that this should in any way be pulling the rug from you in terms of your beliefs and in your faith, because this is just about history, not about, again, topics like theology and so on, which should be kept separate. And so hopefully we'll be able to do that going forward. Thank you.